So, what is the history of the Mormon Church's beliefs towards Black people? In this video, I'm going to be using and did use a lot of research, including churchofjesuschrist.org, to compile information regarding the history of how Mormons viewed Black people, starting with the founding of the religion by Joseph Smith. And then I'll just be, based on the research, walking through a timeline starting with the founding of the church and moving into where things are in terms of the 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was coming into this community and living within this community. And I will conclude the video by talking a little bit about some connections between the views that Mormons have had towards Black people, and the views that they've had towards Black people were different, vastly different than the views that they had towards other ethnic cultural groups. Their views towards Black people are unique, different, and unlike the way Mormons viewed other people of color from other cultural backgrounds. And I will talk about that because that's also in the timeline of events. But after looking at all the research and putting it together, and much of this research can be found very easily online. I'll also include the articles that I'm speaking to specifically in the summary when talking about this video. And I'll be doing, when I'm discussing quotes from LDS church presidents or presidents of BYU or the founder of the Mormon religion, Joseph Smith, I'll be reading directly. I don't want to do any paraphrasing. I want to make sure that the language and the intent behind the language is directly from the sources. And these quotes can be found online, and much of these quotes or writings can be found in the original writings by the presidents that made them in their own handwriting. But let's begin. So, the history of treatment towards Black people, at least towards Black people by Mormons, is significantly worse than their treatment towards any other racial or ethnic group of color. And I can attest to growing up myself, finding that myself as a non-Mormon and my peers that are non-Mormon, being white and myself not being a white person, I did find that my treatment was different than white peers I knew that were non-Mormon. So this rang true, even dating back to the mid-1800s. While the LDS Church is global, and it is global, and there is very strong emphasis on service and proselytizing and mission work, it's very organized. But while the LDS Church is global, in the US, the LDS Church is primarily white. This isn't just because that's what I experienced, that's what the research says. And it is one of the least racially diverse faith traditions in the US, the Mormon religion in the US. I'm not talking about global Mormons, I'm talking about in the United States. This organized religion is one of the least racially diverse, and it is also one of the youngest organized religions. I was raised through Christian faith. Christianity is older than Mormonism. Catholicism is older than Mormonism. Judaism is older than Mormonism. Islam is older than Mormonism. So Mormonism is its newest. It's the newest one, the youngest, and was when I was growing up. But yet at the same time, I could be told I'm going to hell in my classrooms by Mormon peers. And there are several articles that point to, in the US, the population of Mormons of color is less than 0.2%. And growing up, I did not meet a Mormon of color until I got into college, graduate school, came back, driving back home to Mesa. And so I would say at that time I'd met definitely one, so maybe two Mormons of color, and they were Hispanic. I've never personally met a Black Mormon, never. And the only Mormons of color, like I said, were two at the most, and they were Hispanic, and that's it. And that's still true to this day. So let's talk about the timeline. So 1830, Mormonism is launched with the publication of the Book of Mormon by its founder, Joseph Smith. This is a time when many of African descent lived in slavery or were born into slavery. Many Mormon leaders during this time, it's documented, many Mormon leaders during this time had several slaves and supported slavery so much that Mormons would move to creating this as a bill in the state of Utah. So it would become law in 1852. And I will get into speeches given by Mormon leaders encouraging this bill to pass. This is history. It's documented. 1832, Elijah Abel, who is a African American that is prominently discussed in the Mormon Church, and Elijah Abel is one of the earliest African American that throughout his life was dedicated to the LDS Church. And he and his wife, he would later marry, she too was dedicated to the church. They would have several children together. They would attempt to get baptized. Well, they would get baptized several times into the church, but he never received any of the ordinances, permission from the church to be able to achieve what we would call priesthood. And I'll talk about all of that. But Elijah Abel is a very light complected man. He's described as being quadroon or mulatto, quadroon being having a quarter of African blood within your genealogy, and mulatto being of 50%. So I would be identified as mulatto, but having a mixture of, as it is referred to back then, Negro and white. I am going to be using quite a bit of language directly from quotes, directly from history, that describes Black people in ways other than African American. So, listen with care to that. But these, especially in particular, Negro, would be a word that I would hear a lot growing up. If it wasn't the N-word hard ER, I could hear Negro. That would be very common. So back to Elijah Abel, even looking at images of him online, he's very, very light complected and can very much pass. And it's been documented that he did pass as a white passing person of color. The implications of being white passing, the variables, the impact of being white passing in the United States isn't at all discussed by Mormon websites when they're speaking about Elijah Abel, but it's something that should be recognized. And Elijah Abel was the first Black man to be baptized in the church. He was 22 years old. He helped build several temples, including the Salt Lake City temple. He was a carpenter by trade, and he represented the LDS Church as a missionary in New York and Canada. Elijah Abel in 1843 spoke at an LDS branch conference, and interestingly, I remember growing up, conference still happens. I'm not sure how often that happens. I know at a minimum annually, but I don't know if it happens more than that. Friends that I knew that were Mormon going to conference, there would be a time of year when that's happening, and they would all travel up to Utah for conference. So what's going on there? I mean, it's Mormon stuff. I don't know. I'm not LDS. So when I saw, he's speaking at branch conference, I'm thinking, gosh, that's been going on for a very long time, going off to conference. Following his speech, he was told by church leaders, Apostle and Elder John Page and Elder Orson Pratt, that he needs to really preach to his own kind. He really needs to just stick with preaching to other Negroes. Okay. 1847, Elijah Abel, and marries Mary Ann Adams. She's also described as being light-complected and of mixed race. Together, they would be baptized in the LDS Church 3 times, showing their dedication to the church. 1844, February specifically, Joseph Smith, in his own writing, it's online, it's easy to find, has notes regarding placing Negroes on trial in court for attempting to marry white women. They were found guilty by Joseph Smith. The Mormon Church was at this time, and has been for a long time, vehemently opposed to interracial marriage. 1844, this would go on when I get to BYU, when I get to speeches by BYU presidents and LDS presidents. They reinforce their direct opposition to interracial marriages and their concern, worry, and again, opposition to mixed race children. 1844, June specifically, Joseph Smith is murdered. 1847, James Flake, who is a white slave owner, Mormon, had his slave Green Flake, slave Oscar Crosby Smith, and slave Hark Alay Wales accompany Brigham Young to the Salt Lake Valley and were tasked with building homes, planting crops for their enslavers who would arrive the following year. Then we have 1852. This is the year where LDS president at the time, following the passing of Joseph Smith, LDS President Brigham Young would give 2 speeches. This one's just not enough. 2 speeches before the Utah Territorial Legislature providing counsel on a bill. The bill began by being titled An Act in Relation to African Slaves. When Brigham Young is done with this title, he's going to change it to An Act in Relation to Service. Okay? So let's talk about that speech. He gives 2 speeches before the Utah Territorial Legislature providing counsel on a bill in relation to African slavery, which he will reframe to service. He argues that Negroes could and should not hold priesthood. Priesthood in the LDS Church is restricted to only men. I'm not going to get into the details about Mormon ideologies in that regard. But for those that are not Mormon and are unfamiliar with priesthood, in a very, very basic general summary, males enter into priesthood during adolescence. It's described as the power and authority of God, which also provides the power and authority to act in God's name. Priesthood also allows individuals with men being provided or approvals to have priesthood, but it also speaks to what happens beyond life here on earth. It speaks to having the ability and the permission to move into post-life on earth, but the celestial kingdom, which follows life on earth. The celestial kingdom being one of 3 kingdoms in the Mormon faith. In my religion, Christianity, and other organized religions, we refer to things as heaven. In the Mormon church, things are, there's more than that. And there's the 3 kingdoms, the celestial kingdom being the highest level of glory of all 3 kingdoms. And not being given priesthood, not being given permission in that regard does not allow people to be able to live here on and into eternity with their loved ones following their lives here on earth. So it permits their ability to be in what other religions would refer to as heaven. Okay, so let me read some excerpts from Brigham Young's speech. And this is the speech that was given in 1852 at the territorial legislature. So, and this is directly from his speech. I'm going to start at the top of it and just read sections. It's fairly long. You can see and read it in its entirety online. And I'll also make sure that, like I said at the beginning, cite where I'm getting these articles, and that way you can review the content yourself as well. It begins, I have this section in my hand. And again, this is from Brigham Young. I have this section in my hand headed An Act in Relation to African Slavery. I've read it over, made a few alterations. I will remark with regard to slavery, inasmuch as we believe in the Bible, inasmuch as we believe in the ordinances of God, in the priesthood, and order and decrees of God, we must believe in slavery. The colored race have been subjected to severe curses, which they have in their families and their classes and in their various capacities brought upon themselves. And until the curse is removed by him, it's capitalized H, God, who placed it upon them, they must suffer under its consequences. I am not authorized to remove it. I am a firm believer in slavery. Skipping down. In short, as far as the common comforts of life, salvation, light, truth, enjoyment, and understanding are concerned, the Black African has precisely the same privilege as the white man. But they cannot share in the priesthood. They cannot bear rule. They cannot bear rule in any place until the curse is removed from them. They are a servant of servants. I loathe the abuses to which the slave in a great many instances is exposed, although, as a general thing, that part of the Negro race that are in servile bondage are much more comfortable and better provided for than the lower classes of the nations of Europe. Okay. Though the enlightened nation, England, has abolished slavery in her colonies, yet the most damnable slavery exists at the very heart of the nation. I am bold to say that you cannot find a Black man or woman in the United States that has traveled through the period of his life in hunger in the midst of plenty. Yet there are millions upon millions in the cities of Europe who have lived amidst the choicest luxuries of life and died at last in starvation. I mean, we're just, okay, right? Okay. There are many brethren, like, let's go away from Europe. Let's stick with what we're doing to slaves in the United States, shall we? So I'm gonna skip down because there's a whole lot of like, why don't y'all look at Europe and see what they're doing over there? Let's not look over here. The slaves I know are jolly. I mean, so let's transition back. I'm going to skip further down so we can stick with the U.S., Brigham Young. There are many brethren in the South, a great amount of whose means is vested in slaves. Those servants want to come here with their masters. When they come here, the devil is raised. This one is talking and that one is wondering, A strong abolitionist, if you don't know what an abolitionist is, someone that opposes slavery, a strong abolitionist feeling has power over them. And they commence to whisper round their views upon the subject, saying, "Do you think it's right? I'm afraid it's not right." I mean, how dare people question slavery, right? "I know it is right, and there should be a law made to have the slaves serve their masters, because they are not capable of ruling themselves." When the Lord God cursed old Cain, he said, "Until the last drop of Abel's blood receives the priesthood and enjoys the blessings of the same, Cain shall bear the curse. Then Cain is calculated to have his share next, and not until then. Consequently, I am firm in the belief that they ought to dwell in servitude." Service. So he says, the caption of this bill I don't like. I have therefore taken the liberty to alter it. I have said, "an act in relation to manual service," instead of African slavery. Good old psychology knows the power of a reframe. I have also altered the latter part of it, and I am willing the bill should be thrown back to be remodeled. I would like masters to behave well to their servants and to see that every person in the territory is well used. When a master has a Negro and uses him well, he's much better off than if he was free. So being denied priesthood equates to, so let me discuss further, it's not just an inability to reach the celestial kingdom and spend eternity with your family. It also means there is no ability to become sealed in the Mormon temple. Sealing in the Mormon temple is a ceremony, highly regarded. Not anybody can do it. Not any Mormon can do it. There's procedures in place in order to be given the permission to be sealed in the temple, so on and so forth. Those of us that are not provided permission could wait outside on temple grounds or just meet up at whatever church is providing the reception in whatever ward it's going to be. Sealing in the temple does create the existence of families to continue together for all eternity, the celestial kingdom. In summation, at least up to this part of things, the next part of the timeline I pick up in 1852, but at least from this part of things, from 1830, the creation of the religion, all the way up to this time, we have black skin being said by Mormon leaders is a divine disfavor or curse. The Mormon church believing that us as black people are descendants of Cain from the biblical story of Cain and Abel, which I know very well being raised in Christianity. Black people have cursed markings and we are spiritually inferior. White people are pure and superior. What does that language sound like? I know what that language sounds like. That pure, white skin, superior. The bow on this present of discrimination is that it's God's will. That's what Brigham Young is stating. That's what Joseph Smith believed, that this is God's will. This is God's belief. The discrimination is God's will. So we have 1852, those speeches given by Brigham Young, powerful. We have slavery becoming legalized, February 4th, 1852. It's legalized in Utah. It's the first territorial statute prohibiting sex between any African race and white people, not just people of color and white people. Let's be very clear. In the Mormon church, this was always against, in particular, black people of African descent. We're not talking about Hispanics. We're not talking about Asian people. Brigham Young also believed, mixed race, people like myself, that we are offspring which degrade Mormon communities and we diminish priesthood power. Also during this time, I mean, this is like taking it as far as it can be taken. White Mormon missionaries were told not to proselytize and did not proselytize to Black African people, people of African descent. No. In South Africa, converts had to show proof of documentation via genealogy prior to ordination to priesthood or to worship in temples. Bring that proof. Bring your paperwork. So otherwise, go. Because we don't. Not with those people. Virtually, you can't have any power within the church. You're a cursed people, but you can build our things. 1853, Elijah Abel requests priesthood endowments from Brigham Young. How do we think this is going to turn out? He is denied, and he cannot practice any significant traditions or practices central to the LDS faith. 1855, Utah tithe. Tithe is a very, very significant part of being a part of the LDS faith, tithing. Utah tithe records show Abel was listed as giving 10%. I mean, he was dedicated. 10%. Baptized 3 times. 10% of his income to the church. However, he was never allowed to enter LDS temples in Utah in order to participate in other rituals or to be sealed to his wife. In 1879, Elijah petitioned LDS President John Taylor and the Quorum of 12 Apostles. He reached out to the quorum. How do you think they responded? Request denied. They were like, not on my watch. 1888, Utah passes... Oh, this language from the past. And doing my doctoral research when I was in doctoral school. Oh, this brings back memories of this language. Utah passed an anti-miscegenation law. So I'm a product of miscegenation. Miscegenation being the union between a Black person and a white person. I'm a product of miscegenation. Miscegenation, mulatto. But Utah didn't like it. Passed an anti-miscegenation law which prevented marriages between Black and white people. Specifically, Black and white people. Specifically. Because of course Mormons would. What I don't want to hear is, well, this was how the times were back then. No, this is what you believed back then. This isn't what slaves believed who were dying to become free, who were having to bear children into slavery. We were moving into the times of civil war eventually. There was a war because there were people that opposed those beliefs, but the Mormon church believed in it. You were on the wrong side of history, and you were on the wrong side of humanity. And you know what? After slavery, slavery is going to end. But now after slavery, then there was Jim Crow laws. Continued legally supported violence and persecution, legally supported segregation to Black people specifically. And that's going to last 100 years, Jim Crow. And then I have people as an adult coming back to Mesa, Mormons who've known me for so long, questioning me about the problems with blackface. Look up Jim Crow. You'll find out what's wrong with blackface. Look up Jim Crow laws, how Jim Crow came about. So let's go into 1940s and 50s. This is a time where my parents have already been born and are living, the 1940s and 50s. They're already alive. They're already around. So we have some of your parents, definitely grandparents are around during this time. Again, they're on the wrong side of humanity still. Racial integration was more common in the 40s and 50s. LDS president at the time emphasized that racial segregation still applies to men of Black and African descent. Like, they're just not going to let this go. They're not going to let it go. So it's like, okay, we can do a little racial integration, okay, but not with people of Black or African descent. And they're so worried about the, like, men of Black and African descent. Like, they're not worried. They're white Mormons. When I get to high school, let you know, white Mormons are not interested in women of color. Not like it's not happening. It wasn't happening in my school. They're not worried about that. They weren't worried about that in the 40s and 50s. They didn't need to be. And it was still, that was a very clear line. It was a very clear segregatory line when I was in high school. But Black men with white, that's the issue. That's what they're concerned about. Other ethnic minority men, so other men of color that are not Black or of African descent, guess what? They can hold priesthoods, just not Black men. Mm-mm. So in 1940, an LDS committee is formed among the leaders to discuss their belief in the one-drop rule, which is aptly named. If you're unfamiliar with the one-drop rule, you'll look it up. You'll be like, okay, that's what the thinking was. And whether that one drop of Negro blood deprives a man of the right to receive priesthood. Guess what that committee found out? That one drop sure does. That one drop is everything. Again, let's continue to prevent priesthood because of that one drop. That one drop gives you that big curse. 1947, we have LDS leaders explore the expansion of the church in Brazil and other areas of Latin America. But guess what? There's some concerns regarding the percentage of Brazilian population having African ancestry. So they said, okay, that's a concern. 1948, the LDS Church leadership affirms that Negroes may become members of the church, but they are not entitled to priesthood at any time. That's 1948, okay? By 1948, both my parents have been born by this stage. My father many years earlier, and my mom a few years before this decision in the church. Okay, I am going to go from 1948 and move into 1960 and focus quite a bit on BYU, a college many people I knew, if they went to college, I knew a lot of Mormon women that did not go to college following high school graduation. I knew of some that did, and I knew of some that went and were accepted to BYU. And a lot of what I found online in regards to BYU is that they have their stance, which I'm going to talk about. And then very much because of the decisions that they made, because of the ideologies around Black people, impacted the student body, and it very directly impacted athletics, then we'll see how things evolve from there at BYU. So in 1960, BYU, they kicked out the globetrotters, is what they did. They kicked out the fun-loving globetrotters. I mean, starting out things with a bang. And they ban the globetrotters from any future use of their basketball facilities. There are several stories of American students, Black athletes, that describe their horrifying experiences at BYU playing not on BYU teams. Now, that wasn't going to happen for a very long time, but of their treatment entering into Utah and being at the college, even being in the surrounding communities of Utah, not being able to get any housing, not being able to get hotel rooms, not being served in restaurants. This is what's happening. And In the 1960s also, BYU lawyer turned president, Ernest Wilkinson, who I have to say is very earnest from stopping Black people from having any opportunity at his college. But President Wilkinson discovers that a BYU employed a Black man. His name was Edward O. Minor. He's from Florida A&M University and HBCU. And President Wilkinson finds out he was hired to teach during summer school. Guess what happened? His name was submitted with his application, but it didn't include his race. So I didn't really find out till he showed up. And so something had to be done about that. Religious professor Daniel Ludlow informed administrators that Edward O. Minor, he's colored, his words. This was then reported to Vice President Earl Crockett. And President Wilkinson stated he was completely unaware. He says, quote, Crockett never informed me, thinking apparently on the representation that he was light in color and that others wouldn't know it. Thinking, I guess, Crockett thought he was going to be white passing. The man's photograph appeared in the paper the first of this week, from which it was apparent that he was colored. I wish we could take him on our faculty. But the danger in doing so is that students and others take license from this and assume that there's nothing improper about mingling with the other races. Therefore, he was removed because they were afraid of that mingling, that integration piece of it. Can't have that. Get him out of here.